Section 1. The Genesis of the Feudal Order and the Pressures of a Fragmenting World. You know, the history of feudalism doesn't really start with any dramatic moment. There was no treaty signing, no royal decree sent out from some gleaming throne room. Instead, it kind of crept into existence slowly and quietly, like watching dirt settle after an earthquake. If you want to understand why Europe ended up with this rigid, hierarchical system that must have felt absolutely exhausting to live under, you need to go back pretty far. Back to those long centuries of transition after the Western Roman Empire started its very slow collapse. And I do mean slow. This wasn't some sudden fall, like you might imagine. It was more like a painful, drawn-out unraveling that took generations. As Rome's centralized authority faded away, that vast, interconnected world they'd built started breaking apart into thousands of isolated, local fragments. Just think about the scale of the Roman world when it was at its peak. You had this incredible system where a merchant in Britain could use coins minted all the way over in Turkey to buy wine from Italy. And he could travel on roads that were protected by soldiers who were paid from a central treasury sitting in Rome. When that system fell apart, it wasn't just the government that disappeared. It was the entire concept of a public world. Those disciplined legions that used to guard the frontiers? Gone. The paved roads that let gold and information flow quickly across the empire? Crumbling. The predictable legal systems? Replaced by, well, not much of anything really. Instead of another empire stepping in to fill the void, you got a landscape of deep, haunting uncertainty. During this period, what historians call late antiquity, the number one concern for basically anyone was just physical security, staying alive. And that desperate need for safety became the main force that shaped the feudal world. Here's something interesting though. The seeds of feudalism were actually planted inside the Roman Empire itself, centuries before the first medieval knight ever climbed onto a horse. Back in the 3rd century, the empire was going through some seriously rough times. Constant civil wars, runaway inflation, and a devastating plague that killed off huge portions of the workforce. The central government was struggling to protect its citizens or even maintain a stable currency. So what did the Roman elite do? They started a mass exodus from the cities. These wealthy families retreated to their enormous rural estates, which were called latifundia. Since the state couldn't provide protection anymore, these estates became fortified and self-sufficient, like little islands of safety in a dangerous world. To work these massive properties, the owners relied on tenant farmers called coloni. Eventually, through imperial decree, these farmers were actually forbidden from leaving the land. The official reason was to make sure the state had a stable tax base, but in reality, this created the legal and economic blueprint for what would become the medieval serf. The whole relationship was already shifting from a public one, citizen and state, to a private one, tenant and landlord. That's a huge change in how society was organized. When the Roman administrative structure finally collapsed in the West, it left behind this massive power vacuum. Various Germanic tribes moved in to fill it: the Franks, the Visigoths, the Saxons, and many others. Now, these tribes didn't have the Roman concept of a state as this abstract, public entity. To the Germanic way of thinking, law and power were deeply personal. They were rooted in the bond between a chieftain and his warriors. This brings us to the concept of the comitatus, which was a tradition where a leader provided food, weapons, and a share of whatever they plundered to his warriors. In exchange, those warriors gave him absolute loyalty on the battlefield. As these tribal leaders became kings and settled down in the former Roman provinces, they ran into a very practical problem. They had no way to pay their followers. Back in the Roman era, a soldier got paid in actual coins, which he then used to buy food and supplies. But by the 7th and 8th centuries, those Mediterranean trade routes, basically the circulatory system of the ancient world, had been seriously disrupted. There's this famous historian named Henri Pirenne who argued that the expansion of the Islamic Caliphate essentially landlocked Western Europe, cutting off the flow of gold and luxury goods. Whether or not that was the only cause, the end result was what's called a natural economy, where gold and silver were almost non-existent. Without money to pay an army, a king had to reward his followers with the only thing of real value that was left: land itself. This is actually where we get the word feudalism from. It comes from the old Frankish word fehu, which originally meant cattle. Cattle were the primary form of wealth for nomadic tribes. Over time, this evolved into the medieval Latin fiefdom, or as we say in English, the fief. In the beginning, these land grants were often temporary. They were called a benefice. But as warfare became more specialized, the grants became permanent. And that specialization was driven by a piece of technology that might seem simple but was actually revolutionary: the stirrup. For the first time ever, a rider could brace himself properly on his horse and deliver a massive, concentrated blow with a spear or lance. This created the medieval knight. But here's the thing: a knight was incredibly expensive to maintain. A single horse, a suit of iron chainmail, a sword, and the necessary attendants cost more than an entire small village could produce in a year. To support this heavy artillery of the Middle Ages, the king had to grant the warrior a permanent estate, what was called a knight's fee, that would generate enough income to keep him battle-ready at all times. The structure of feudalism really got hammered into place during what historians call the second wave of invasions in the 9th and 10th centuries. This was probably the most terrifying time to be a regular person in Europe. From the north came the Vikings, using their revolutionary longships to strike hundreds of miles inland along river systems. They were completely unpredictable and moved faster than any royal army could possibly respond. From the east came the Magyars, nomadic horsemen who raided with lightning speed. And from the south came Saracen raiders who constantly harassed the Mediterranean coasts. Against these threats coming from multiple directions at once, a centralized, national army was basically useless. Think about it. If a Viking fleet suddenly appeared on the horizon, you couldn't wait weeks for a messenger to reach the king and for the king to raise an army. You needed protection right now, immediately. This desperate need for immediate defense led to what historians call incastellamento, which is basically the rapid fortification of the European countryside. Local strongmen started building castles. At first they were just mounds of earth and timber, without even waiting for royal permission. The local peasants, who were left completely defenseless by their distant king, made a grim but logical bargain. They gave up their personal freedom and their small independent plots of land to whoever controlled the local castle. In a ceremony called commendation, a farmer would literally place himself under the lord's protection. The lord became the farmer's protector, and the farmer became the lord's man, or serf. This wasn't a choice people made because they wanted to. It was a choice made with a sword hanging over their heads. This was the moment when the free farmer of antiquity disappeared and was replaced by the medieval serf, tied permanently to the manor. At the heart of this entire legal system was something called radical title. In the feudal system, the king was theoretically the owner of every single blade of grass in his kingdom. But he didn't own the land as a private individual. He held it as a steward of God. The king would then grant large portions of this land, called tenancies in chief, to his most powerful supporters, people like dukes and earls. This wasn't a sale of land. It was more like a loan or a lease. The duke held the land from the king. The count held land from the duke. The baron held land from the count. And the knight held land from the baron. This process of slicing the land into smaller and smaller pieces is called subinfeudation. At every single link in this chain, a contract was formed. The person higher up provided land and protection. The person lower down provided military service and political counsel. To really understand how this worked, we should look at the specific ranks and how they varied across different parts of Europe. At the very top stood the king, who was called the Lord Paramount. In England, especially after William the Conqueror showed up in 1066, the king's power was theoretically absolute because he claimed every acre of land by right of conquest. But in France, the early kings were often far weaker than their own vassals. A French king might only really control the land immediately around Paris, while someone like the Duke of Normandy or the Duke of Burgundy ruled territories that were essentially independent nations, even though technically they were holding them from the king. Moving down the ladder, you've got the Duke. The title comes from the Latin dux, which means a military leader. In the Germanic lands, these were called the stem duchies, powerful tribal units that existed before the empire itself. A duke was often basically a sub-king in everything but name, with his own courts and even his own coins. Below the duke was the marquis, or in German lands, the margrave. This was a specialized rank for people who ruled the marches, which were the dangerous and unstable borderlands of a kingdom. Because they were on the front lines against invaders, a marquis was granted special rights. They could build more castles and raise larger armies than a lord living in the safe interior of the country. The count, or in English tradition the earl, was originally a Roman administrative official. In France, a count was nearly a sovereign ruler of his county. In England, the term earl comes from the Viking word jarl. An English earl was often more closely tied to the king's administrative system, essentially acting as a representative of royal law in the local shires. Beneath the count was the viscount, who originally served as the count's deputy but eventually became his own hereditary rank. Then you had the baron, which was the fundamental rank of the high nobility. A baron held a barony, which was typically a collection of several manors. These were the men who formed the core of the king's great council. And finally, at the lowest rung of the noble ladder, you had the knight. The knight held a knight's fee, which was the minimum amount of land required to support the massive expenses of medieval warfare. This meant enough income to pay for at least 3 horses, a full suit of chainmail, and several armed attendants. By the time you get to the year 1000, this pyramid of power had become the defining reality of European life. It was a world of total, crushing interdependence. No one was truly free in the way we understand that word today. But everyone, from the king all the way down to the serf, had a specific place and a specific duty. The king needed the duke for his soldiers. The duke needed the knight for his military expertise. And absolutely everyone relied on the peasant to provide the food that fueled the entire machine. This system saved Europe from the chaos of the post-Roman world, but it did so by binding every single human being into this dense, interlocking web of personal promises and lifelong obligations. The great chain of being had been forged, and for the next several centuries, it would be the only thing holding the world together. As we move through this landscape, you have to realize that these titles weren't just fancy names or honorifics. They were actual job descriptions. A baron wasn't just rich, he was a military commander and a judge. A knight wasn't just a soldier, he was a local landlord with real responsibilities. Even the names of the land itself carried serious weight. You had allodial land, which was very rare land held without owing service to any lord. And then you had fief land, which was held on the condition of service. This distinction created this incredibly complex legal map where a single person might be a lord in one village and a vassal in the next village over. It led to a world of overlapping loyalties that really defined the entire medieval experience. This was a world where you didn't look to a written constitution for your rights. You looked to your customs. If your father had paid a certain amount of grain to the lord for 100 years, that payment became your right. It was a slow-moving, traditional, and deeply conservative society, born out of a desperate need for order in an age of fire and iron. The feudal system was the answer to a broken world. It was a way to turn the wreckage of Rome into a new kind of stability, one based not on the power of the state, but on the power of a man's word. Section 2. The rites of homage, fealty, and the legal architecture of the fief. So if the political and economic pressures of the post-Roman world gave us the why of feudalism, the rituals of homage and fealty gave us the how. In a society where most people couldn't read and where centralized written law courts had basically disappeared, The stability of the entire social order rested on these public, performative, and sacred contracts. These weren't just fancy ceremonies full of pomp and circumstance. They were the constitutional bedrock of the medieval world. To really understand how deep these bonds went, we have to look past the surface-level ritual and examine the specific, deliberate legalities of what was called the commendation. This was a world where a man's physical gestures and spoken words were just as legally binding as a modern notarized contract. Picture yourself standing in the great hall of a powerful fortress sometime in the 11th century. The air is probably thick with the smell of wood smoke, roasted meat, and the damp wool of all the assembled witnesses. The ceremony of homage was designed to be a vivid, unforgettable memory, because those witnesses were literally the only database the legal system had. The prospective vassal, who might himself be a powerful count or just a simple knight, would approach his lord. This was a moment of profound psychological weight. The vassal was required to be completely unarmed and ungirt, which means he had removed his sword belt and his spurs. His head was bare, no hat, no helmet. This vulnerability was absolutely essential. It signaled that he was coming in peace and that he was placing his life and his entire future in the hands of the man sitting before him. The most iconic and legally significant moment of the entire ritual was something called the immixtio manuum, or the joining of hands. The vassal would kneel before the Lord and place his hands, palms together, between the palms of the Lord. If you think about this gesture for a moment, it's incredibly intimate and powerful. In the legal language of the time, the Lord was receiving the man. By closing his hands over the vassal's hands, the Lord was physically demonstrating his duty to shield this man from all enemies. It was a tactile representation of the feudal bargain. The vassal gives his service and the Lord gives his protection. It's a gesture that actually survives in a softened form today in the way we pray or the way we shake hands to seal a deal. But in the Middle Ages, this was a total surrender of the self. Following this physical gesture, the vassal would speak what was called the formal declaration of intent. In the Old French of the Norman courts, he might say something like, "I become your man from this day forward, of life and limb and of earthly worship." This created the bond of vassalidium. It's really important to note that this bond was, in theory, lifelong. To break it without a recognized legal cause was to commit felony. Now, today we use the word felony to describe any serious crime, but in the feudal era, it specifically meant a breach of the contract between a lord and a vassal. A felon was a man who had betrayed his oath, and the punishment was the total forfeiture of his land, his titles, and his entire place in society. He became a man without a lord, which in the Middle Ages meant he was essentially a man without any law to protect him. Once the act of homage was completed, the vassal would stand up and transition from the political sphere into the religious one through something called the oath of fealty. If homage created the social contract, fealty, which comes from the Latin fidelitas, sanctified it. The vassal would place his hand upon a sacred object, most commonly a Bible, but very often on the actual physical relics of a saint that were housed in a golden, jewel-encrusted reliquary. By swearing fealty, the vassal was bringing God himself into the contract as the ultimate witness and enforcer. While homage was about what you would do, like providing 40 days of military service, fealty was about how you would behave. The vassal swore to avoid any action that would cause physical harm to the lord, damage his property, or bring dishonor to his family. Because the oath was sworn on holy relics, a faithless vassal wasn't just a criminal. He was a perjurer and a sinner who risked excommunication by the church and eternal damnation. This religious dimension was especially vital in the Germanic lands of the Holy Roman Empire. The German concept of Lehnswesen focused heavily on something called true, or Germanic faithfulness. In a sprawling empire that stretched all the way from the North Sea down to the Mediterranean, the emperor couldn't possibly be everywhere at once. The oath of fealty acted as a kind of spiritual glue that held the distant territories of Saxony, Bohemia, and Lombardy together. The emperor relied on the fact that his vassals feared the wrath of God more than they feared his distant army. This creates a really fascinating contrast with the English system, which was much more focused on the administrative and land-based concept of tenure than the purely personal faithfulness that was emphasized in Germany. The final act of this complex ceremony was the investiture. This was the formal delivery of the fief itself. Obviously, a lord couldn't just pick up a 10,000-acre estate and physically hand it to his vassal, so the law made use of what were called corporeal symbols. The lord would hand the vassal a specific object that represented the land. This was known as season. It might be a handful of earth taken from the fields, a leafy branch from the forest, or even a piece of turf. In more specialized cases, the symbols became even more abstract. A glove might represent the transfer of judicial authority over a town, or a banner might represent the right to lead a company of soldiers. Without this physical handoff of a symbol, the legal transfer of land was considered incomplete in the eyes of the manorial court. In the case of what's called ecclesiastical feudalism, where a king was investing a bishop or an abbot with land, the symbols were the ring and the staff. This seemingly simple ritual actually sparked one of the greatest political conflicts in all of human history, the investiture controversy. For decades in the 11th and 12th centuries, the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor fought bitterly over who had the right to hand those symbols to a new bishop. The Pope argued that as a spiritual leader, only the Church could invest a bishop. The Emperor argued that because the bishop held vast estates and provided knights for the imperial army, he was essentially a secular vassal who must be invested by the crown. This conflict proves that these supposedly boring rituals were actually the high-stakes power struggles of the era, determining where the line between church and state would eventually be drawn. As we look across the map of Europe, we can see that these laws and rituals weren't uniform at all. They were shaped by the local soil and history of each region. In southern France and Italy, the ghost of Roman law still haunted the legal system. Here, feudalism was often written. Instead of just relying on the memory of witnesses in a great hall, notaries would draft something called a convenientia, a written contract that outlined every single duty and every single acre in meticulous detail. In these regions, you also found more allodial land, which was land held in absolute ownership without owing service to any lord. This created a kind of hybrid society where the rigid feudal pyramid was often bypassed by wealthy families who owned their land outright. This led to a much more independent and often more litigious nobility than you found up in the north. In England, the law of the fief was remarkably uniform because of the crushing power of the royal courts that were established after 1066. The English developed a highly specific tax called the relief. When a vassal died, his heir didn't just automatically walk onto the land and take over. He had to pay a relief to the king to relieve, or pick up the fief. This was a massive source of revenue for the crown and a constant point of tension. If a king set the relief too high, he risked sparking a baronial revolt. The English system also strictly enforced something called primogeniture, where the eldest son took the entire fief. This wasn't about being mean to the younger sons. It was about military readiness. If a fief that was supposed to provide one fully equipped knight got split between 4 sons, none of them would be wealthy enough to buy the horse and armor needed. By keeping the land whole and intact, the English ensured that the king's army stayed at full strength. France, by contrast, was this dizzying mosaic of what's called customary law. In some provinces, the law allowed for partible inheritance, where a fief could be sliced into smaller and smaller pieces to be divided among multiple heirs. This led to the creation of fractional fiefs. You might actually have a man who was the lord of 1/8 of a knight's fee. This made the French landscape incredibly fragmented and led to a whole class of poor knights, who had the title and the noble blood but lived in little more than a fortified farmhouse because their inheritance had been sliced too thin over the generations. This fragmentation often made it really difficult for the French king to centralize power, because he had to deal with thousands of tiny, squabbling vassals rather than a few dozen powerful ones. One of the most fascinating examples of perfect feudalism actually occurred outside of Europe entirely, in the Crusader states of the Levant. Because the Crusaders were a small, outnumbered military elite ruling over a hostile population, they couldn't afford any legal ambiguity whatsoever. They created something called the Assizes of Jerusalem, which is arguably the most complete and rigid feudal code ever written. It detailed absolutely everything: exactly how many days of service were owed, what happened if a lord failed to protect his vassal's family, and even how to handle the inheritance of a knight who died in a foreign land. It was feudalism designed for a permanent state of emergency, a military constitution that prioritized the readiness of the armored knight above absolutely everything else. The result of all these rituals and laws was a set of two primary obligations that defined the life of any nobleman: auxilium and concilium, or aid and counsel. Aid was primarily military in nature. A vassal was generally required to provide 40 days of knightly service each year at his own expense. If the king was at war, the vassal had to show up with his horse, his armor, and his own contingent of soldiers. But aid also had financial components that were triggered by major life events in the lord's family. There were 3 standard feudal aids that were recognized across Europe: paying the lord's ransom if he was captured in battle, covering the massive costs of knighting the lord's eldest son, and providing a dowry for the marriage of the lord's eldest daughter. These were the moments when the vassal had to reach deep into his own coffers to support the prestige of the man above him. Counsel was the duty to attend the lord's court. This wasn't some social invitation or a fancy dinner party. It was a burdensome legal requirement. The vassals were the peers of the realm, and they were the ones who acted as the jury for one another. If a baron was accused of a crime or if a dispute arose over a boundary line, he was judged by his fellow vassals, not by the king alone. This concept of judgment by peers is the direct ancestor of our modern jury system. It was based on the idea that only a man of equal rank could truly understand the honor and the obligations of the accused. The Lord's Court was the place where all the boring facts of land tenure were hammered out, and where the custom of the manor was defended against any attempt at royal overreach. But what happened when the bond broke? This is where the legal system became truly dramatic. If a vassal failed in his duties, the lord would summon him to court to face forfeiture, where the land would be seized and returned to the lord's domain. But if the lord was the one who failed, if he abused the vassal's family, seized property without legal cause, or failed to provide the protection he had promised, the vassal actually had the legal right of defiance. This comes from the word diffidatio, or the formal breaking of faith. The vassal would send a formal letter or a messenger to the lord, essentially saying, "I am no longer your man." In many parts of Europe, especially in the Holy Roman Empire, this led to a legalized state of private war. A vassal could actually go to war with his former lord to defend his rights, provided he had followed all the correct ritualistic steps of defiance first. By the time we reached the High Middle Ages in the 13th century, these rituals had created a Europe that was this dense, interlocking web of personal promises. Every manor house and every castle was a node in a massive network of joined hands and sworn oaths. It was a system that relied entirely on the integrity of the individual's word, backed by the absolutely terrifying authority of the church. It wasn't just a way of holding land. It was a way of holding an entire world together through the sheer force of personal loyalty. Through the slow, repetitive performance of these rites, the chaos of the post-Roman vacuum was replaced by a predictable, if absolutely grueling, order. As we move into our next section, we'll see how this legal architecture supported the most iconic figure of the entire age: the knight, that professional warrior whose entire existence was paid for by all the boring legalities of the fief. Section 3: The Knight, Military Technology, Regional Professionalism, and the Chivalric Code. The legal architecture of the fief and all those rituals of homage were designed to support one specific, vital, and incredibly expensive figure: the knight. In the feudal hierarchy, the knight was the specialist of the battlefield, the heavy artillery of the Middle Ages. But to view the knight simply as a soldier is to really miss the complexity of his role in the medieval imagination. He was a tenant, a landlord, a judge, and a member of this transnational secular order that actually transcended the borders of individual kingdoms. To reach a deep understanding of this class, we have to look past all those romanticized tales of King Arthur and examine the crushing costs of their equipment, the grueling decades of their training, and how the concept of the knight differed between, say, the sun-drenched plains of Castile and the urban towers of Italy. Before a man could ever dream of being dubbed a knight, he had to be supported by the economic engine known as the knight's fee. This wasn't just some patch of dirt. It was a specific unit of land that was carefully calculated to provide sufficient income to maintain a warrior in peak condition. In the 11th and 12th centuries, being a knight was not merely about owning a sword. A knight required at least 3 specialized horses. There was the destrier or the great horse, which was bred specifically for power, temperament, and the ability to carry a man in full iron mail. These horses were basically the tanks of their day, trained to kick and bite in the absolute chaos of a melee. Then there was the palfrey, which was a more comfortable horse used for traveling long distances, and at least one pack horse to carry all the knight's massive gear. The cost of a knight's armor was absolutely astronomical, often equivalent to the price of a small modern corporate jet in relative terms. A full suit of chainmail, known as a hauberk, was a masterpiece of labor-intensive craftsmanship. It consisted of approximately 30,000 interlocking iron rings. Every single one of those rings had to be hand-forged, closed, and individually riveted by a blacksmith. This process took months of specialized labor. By the mid-13th century, as weapons became more powerful, the knight began adding steel plates on top of the chainmail, greaves for the shins, a breastplate for the torso, and that iconic great helm that covered the entire face. When you factor in the cost of a shield, a primary broadsword, a secondary dagger, a 14-foot ash lance, and the wages for at least 2 armed attendants, it becomes really clear why knighthood was an inherently exclusionary club. This economic pressure meant that the knight's fee was essentially the minimum bar for entry into the nobility. In England, the Domesday Book suggests there were roughly 6,000 of these fees in the entire country. If a family's land got split through inheritance or lost through bad management, they might actually lose their knightly status because they could no longer afford the tools of the trade. This created a fascinating and often quite dangerous social class: the landless knight, or the knight-errant. These were younger sons who had the noble blood and the expensive training but no land to support them. They were forced to wander around Europe as mercenaries or tournament hunters, constantly looking for a lord to serve or a prize to win so they wouldn't fall back into the ranks of the peasantry. The transformation of a boy into a knight was a 14-year apprenticeship in violence and etiquette. It usually began at the age of 7, when a boy of noble birth was sent away from his mother's care to the castle of his father's lord or maybe a powerful uncle. This was a deliberate move to harden the child and build political alliances between families. At this stage he served as a page. His education was not academic at all. He likely never learned to read or write fluently. Instead, his entire world was one of courtly behavior. He learned how to carve meat at the Lord's table, how to pour wine correctly, how to dance, and how to play chess, which was considered a vital exercise in military strategy and patience. He was constantly watched for signs of grace and discipline. At the age of 14, the page was promoted to a squire. This was the professional stage of his training, and the physical demands became absolutely grueling. The squire was the knight's shadow. He was responsible for the armoring, the complex and exhausting process of dressing the knight for battle, making sure every strap was tight and every rivet was secure. He spent hours every single day in what was called pel training, which involved striking a heavy wooden post with a sword that was often twice the weight of a real one. This built up the specific muscle groups needed for a cavalry charge. He also had to master the couched lance. This was the revolutionary tactic of the feudal era. Instead of throwing a spear, the knight tucked the lance firmly under his arm, using the momentum and weight of the charging horse to deliver a blow of several thousand pounds of force per square inch. This required incredible core strength and a truly terrifying level of equestrian skill. As we look across the map of medieval Europe, we can see that the reality of the knight was highly regional, shaped by the specific threats and cultures of each land. In England, the knight was often what you might call a country gentleman. Because the English crown was more centralized than the French monarchy, knights spent a significant amount of time acting as local administrators. They served as sheriffs, tax collectors, and knights of the shire in the early parliaments. The English knight was as much a bureaucrat and a lawyer as he was a warrior. He lived on his manor, managed his crops, and represented his neighbors in the royal courts. In Germany, the system produced a really unique paradox: the ministerials. These were serf knights, men who were legally unfree and technically the property of the emperor or a great duke, yet they held knightly status, wore expensive armor, and managed vast estates. This shows you how feudalism could bend traditional social categories to meet military needs. The emperor needed a loyal class of warriors who couldn't legally quit or switch sides, so he created this class of noble slaves, who became some of the most powerful and wealthy administrators in the entire Holy Roman Empire. In Spain, the knight was defined by the Reconquista, the centuries-long frontier war against the Moorish caliphates. Because the border was constantly shifting, the Spanish knights, the hidalgos, were often much poorer than their French counterparts but far more numerous. Their lives were focused on something called the cabalgata, or the lightning-fast cattle raid. In Spain, the knight was basically a frontiersman, living in a state of permanent mobilization. He didn't live in some grand palace. He lived in a fortified tower on a dusty ridge, ready to mount his horse at a moment's notice to defend the village's livestock from raiders. In Italy, the knight was often a city dweller, which was a concept that seemed absolutely bizarre to the rural nobility of Northern Europe. While French nobles looked down on trade as base and ignoble, Italian knights lived in fortified urban towers in cities like Florence, Milan, or Venice. They were heavily involved in banking, international commerce, and cloth manufacturing. This created a mercantile nobility that was incredibly wealthy and sophisticated, leading to a culture where a knight might be just as skilled at accounting as he was at jousting. These urban knights eventually formed the backbone of the Italian city-state's resistance against the Holy Roman emperors. By the 12th century, the church and the high nobility sought to civilize this entire class of professional killers through something called the Code of Chivalry. The word comes from the French chevalerie, which literally means horse soldiery. Chivalry was never a single written law code. Instead, it was a set of competing and often contradictory ideals: military prowess, religious devotion, and courtly love. The church, in particular, was absolutely terrified by the unchecked violence of the knightly class. They promoted something called the peace and truce of God, attempting to divert knightly violence away from fellow Christians and toward the infidel in the Crusades. A knight was told he should be a Miles Christi, a soldier of Christ. This eventually led to the formation of the great military orders, like the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. These men were monk knights, taking vows of poverty and chastity while remaining the most elite shock troops in the entire world. At the same time, the royal courts of Europe developed the ideal of courtly love. This taught that the knight should be softened and refined by the influence of a noble lady. He was expected to be as gentle and poetic in the great hall as he was fierce and terrifying on the battlefield. While this is often romanticized in modern movies, it actually had a very practical feudal purpose. It gave the thousands of landless squires and younger sons a reason to stay at a lord's court and behave politely, rather than roaming the countryside as bandits. If you could convince a young warrior that his honor depended on his poetic devotion to a lady, you could control his violent impulses pretty effectively. The primary cultural expression of this knightly class was the tournament. In the 11th century, these weren't the polite, orchestrated jests we see at Renaissance fairs today. They were called the melee, a full-scale mock battle fought across miles of open countryside between two teams of hundreds of knights. There were almost no rules whatsoever. The goal was to capture an opponent and hold him for ransom. A successful tournament knight, like the famous William Marshal, who rose from being a landless fourth son to eventually becoming the regent of England, could make an absolute fortune. Marshal is said to have captured over 500 knights in his career, taking their horses and armor as his prize. The tournament was basically the professional sports league of the feudal world, serving as a lethal training exercise, a massive social event, and a way to redistribute wealth among the nobility. The climax of a warrior's long journey was something called the dubbing. Originally, this was a simple and quite violent act called the accolade, a heavy blow to the neck with a fist or the flat of a sword. It was meant to be the last blow the knight would ever receive without returning it. But as the centuries passed, the church turned the dubbing into this deeply religious, secular sacrament. The candidate would spend the night before the ceremony in what was called a vigil of arms in a dark chapel. His old clothes were replaced by a white robe to symbolize purity, a red robe to symbolize the blood he must be willing to shed, and a black robe to remind him of the death he would eventually face. When the Lord finally struck him on the shoulder and said, "I make thee knight," the young man ceased to be a mere servant. He was now a member of a transnational elite. A knight from the Highlands of Scotland could travel all the way to a castle in the Kingdom of Hungary and be recognized as a social equal by the local lord. They shared a common language of heraldry, a common code of conduct, and a common legal status as holders of a fief. This international brotherhood of the sword was the only thing that gave Europe any real sense of shared identity during the long centuries of fragmentation. As we move into our next section, we're going to descend from the high, drafty towers of the knightly class down into the muddy, fertile fields of the manor. We'll explore the lives of the 90% of the population whose grueling labor, day after day and season after season, paid for the knight's horse, the lord's castle, and the bishop's cathedral. We'll see that while the knight lived for honor, the peasant lived for the harvest. Section 4 of Manorialism, the economic engine and the life of the peasantry. While the feudal system governed the relationships between the elites, those whom we've called the bellators or those who fight, the system of manorialism governed the relationship between the nobility and the land itself. If feudalism was the political and military skeleton of the Middle Ages, manorialism was the flesh and blood that sustained it. To understand the medieval world, you really have to understand the manor, which was this nearly self-sufficient economic universe. To a person living in the year 1100, the manor was the center of their entire world. It was their grocery store, their employer, their court of law, and their complete social circle all rolled into one. We're going to explore the precise layout of these estates, the grueling agricultural calendar that dictated every breath the peasants took, and the legal distinctions that separated the free from the unfree. A medieval manor was far more than just a large farm. It was a jurisdictional and economic unit. At its center stood the manor house, which was the residence of the lord or his representative, the steward. In the early feudal period, this might be just a simple fortified timber hall, but by the 13th century, it often became a stone complex with a solar for the lord's family and a great hall for communal dining and legal proceedings. Surrounding the house were what were called the domain lands, the best and most fertile fields on the entire estate, which were reserved exclusively for the lord's use. The labor needed to farm these lands wasn't provided by hired hands. It was provided by the peasants themselves as part of their feudal rent. Beyond the domain lay the village, which was a cluster of wattle and daub cottages with thatched roofs. Each cottage had a small garden plot behind it where a family might grow a few onions or keep a handful of chickens. The most critical and fascinating part of the manor was something called the open field system. Unlike modern farming where you see fenced-in private lots, the manor's arable land was divided into 2 or 3 massive unfenced fields. These were then subdivided into long narrow strips known as cellions. A single peasant family might hold 30 different strips, but those strips were scattered all across the fields. This ensured a primitive but absolutely vital form of fairness. No single family held all the fertile soil near the river, and they weren't stuck with only the rocky soil near the woods either. It forced the village to work as a single organism. Because the strips were side by side, everyone had to plant the same crop at the same time and harvest it together. You couldn't be an independent farmer on a medieval manor. You were part of a communal machine. The productivity of this machine rested on something called the three-field revolution, which was a technological advancement that slowly but surely transformed the population density of Europe. Under the older Roman two-field system, half the land was left fallow, or unplanted, each year to let it recover its nutrients. The three-field system was far more sophisticated. In this cycle, the first field was planted in the autumn with winter wheat or rye. The second field was planted in the spring with nitrogen-fixing crops like peas, beans, or lentils, or perhaps grains like oats and barley. The third field was left fallow for cattle to graze upon, and their manure would naturally fertilize the soil for the next year. This rotation increased the food supply by a staggering 33% and provided a much more varied diet that was rich in vegetable proteins. This is the boring fact that actually allowed the Middle Ages to happen. Without this extra food, you couldn't have had the population boom that built the great cathedrals or fueled the Crusades. The peasant's life was totally enslaved to the agricultural calendar, and the physical reality of their work was defined by something called the heavy-wheeled plow. This wasn't the simple scratch plow that was used in the light soils of the Mediterranean. In the damp, heavy clay of northern Europe, you needed a massive iron-tipped instrument that could cut deep into the earth and actually turn it over. This plow required a team of 8 oxen to pull it. Because such a team was far too expensive for any single family to own, peasants had to pool their oxen together. This further cemented the communal nature of the village. If you didn't get along with your neighbor, you literally couldn't plow your field. The year began in the dark months of January and February, focusing on indoor tasks like mending tools and threshing grain by hand with flails, which was a backbreaking process of beating the stalks to separate out the wheat. March was the month of the spring sowing, a period of really intense labor behind the plow. But the most critical months were August and September, the harvest. This was boon work time. Every man, woman, and child was required by law to be out in the fields to gather the grain before the autumn rains came. Failure to bring in the harvest meant starvation for the entire community. Following the harvest came the legal rite of gleaning, where the poorest members of the village, the widows and the orphans, were allowed to pick up the stray stalks of grain that had been left behind by the reapers. When we talk about the people who actually lived on the manor, we have to recognize that they weren't just this monolithic mass of peasants. There were distinct legal layers, and the difference between them was literally a matter of life and death. At the top of the village hierarchy were the free tenants or freemen. These individuals held their land by paying a fixed money rent. They had the right to leave the manor, to sell their land, and to marry without needing the Lord's permission. While they still owed certain symbolic services to the Lord, they were legally free and could seek justice in the king's royal courts. Below them were the serfs or villains. A serf was not a slave. He could not be bought or sold as an individual, but he was bound to the soil. If the lord sold the manor to another noble, the serf stayed with the land. His entire life was governed by the custom of the manor. He owed week work, usually 3 days a week of labor on the lord's domain, and boon work during the harvest season. Beneath the serfs were the cotters or boarders. These were the poorest of the poor, holding only a small cottage and a tiny garden plot, but no strips at all in the large open fields. They often had to work as day laborers for the wealthier peasants or for the lord just to survive. But even for the poorest people, the manor provided certain common rights that are almost completely forgotten today. There was the right of pannage, which allowed peasants to turn their pigs loose into the lord's woods to eat acorns and beech mast. There was estover, which was the right to collect fallen wood for fuel, and turbary, the right to cut peat for the hearth. These tiny micro-rights were literally the difference between freezing to death in the winter and surviving. The glue that held this entire social hierarchy together was the manorial court, which was also known as the court leet. This was held several times a year in the great hall of the manor. It was presided over by the lord or his steward, but the jury actually consisted of the peasants themselves. The court handled all the mundane but absolutely vital business of the village. It fined peasants who allowed their cows to wander into the wheat fields. It settled disputes over boundary markers. And it collected the lord's various fees. These fees were numerous and often really frustrating to the peasantry. There was the heriot, which was basically a death tax where the lord took the family's best animal when a tenant died. There was the merchet, which was a fee paid when a daughter got married, and the multure, which was a fee for the mandatory use of the lord's mill to grind grain. While this all sounds pretty exploitative to our modern ears, the court also protected the peasant in important ways. Because the court's decisions were based on the custom of the manor as it has existed from time out of mind, the lord could not suddenly double the rent or seize a serf's land without a specific legal reason that was recognized by the village elders. There was a social contract even at the lowest level of society. The peasant gave his labor, but in return he received a guaranteed plot of land and the physical protection of the lord's castle. In an age of Viking raids and private wars, that was a bargain most people were willing to make. Life on a manor in the English Midlands was vastly different from life in the Mediterranean South. In England and northern France, the classic manor, with heavy ploughs and nucleated villages, where everyone lived in a central cluster, was the norm. The damp, heavy clay soils required that communal 8-oxen team and the long strip field system. But in southern France, Italy, and Spain, the climate and soil led to a completely different structure. The soil was lighter, which allowed for the use of the scratch plow, which could be pulled by just a single horse or donkey. This led to more fragmented, individual farms rather than the large communal fields you found in the north. In Italy, many peasants were actually sharecroppers, known as mezzadri, who split their actual harvest 50-50 with the landlord rather than providing labor service. Every manor also had its church, and for the peasant, the church was the only building they would ever enter in their entire lives that was filled with art, color, and music. The parish priest was often of peasant stock himself, though he was likely the only literate man in the entire village. The church served as the village bank, the school, and the community center all at once. The tithe, a 10% tax on all produce, was collected here to support the clergy and the poor. The church porch was where legal contracts were witnessed and where the local market often got started. The tolling of the church bell was the only clock the villagers had, marking the hours for prayer, for work, and for rest. To really understand the physical reality of all this, we have to imagine the peasant's actual home. These were simple structures of wattle and daub, which was a lattice of wooden strips plastered over with a mixture of wet soil, clay, sand, animal dung, and straw. The floor was usually just packed earth covered in rushes. In the winter, the family would actually bring their most valuable livestock like a cow or a few sheep into the house with them. This wasn't just for the safety of the animals. The body heat of the livestock was a vital source of warmth for the humans living there. The boring life of the manor was a constant struggle for calories and warmth, but it was also a life of intense stability. A peasant knew exactly where they belonged in the world, and they knew that as long as they followed the custom and the calendar, the manor would provide for them. As the sun set over the manor, the peasant would return to their dark cottage to eat a meal of pottage, which was a thick vegetable stew thickened with oats or barley, and coarse black bread. Their world was incredibly small. Most peasants never traveled more than 10 miles from their place of birth in their entire lives. But it was a world of intense communal bonds, where everyone knew everyone and everyone depended on everyone else. As we move into our next section, we're going to look at the higher powers that governed even the lords themselves. The great church and its role as the ultimate landlord and moral arbiter of the feudal world. We'll see how those who pray were often just as powerful and just as land-hungry as those who fight. Section 5. The Church as a Feudal Power, the Crown, the Cross, and the Three Orders. To understand the medieval world, you have to recognize that it wasn't merely some secular or military arrangement. It was a worldview that was deeply and inextricably intertwined with the Roman Catholic Church. In the medieval mind, there was no separation between church and state in the modern sense of a secular government versus a private faith. The church was the largest and most stable landowner in all of Europe, the sole source of literacy and education, and the supreme moral authority that provided what was called the Great Chain of Being, the belief that every person was placed in their specific social rank by divine will. But the church didn't merely observe the feudal system from the sidelines. It was a central active participant in it, functioning as a state within a state with its own laws, its own taxes, and its own military obligations. By the height of the Middle Ages, the church owned approximately 1/3 of all the land in Western Europe. This absolutely staggering amount of property didn't appear overnight. It was the result of centuries of what were called pious donations. Kings and nobles, fearing for the state of their eternal souls as they approached death, would bequeath vast estates, forests, and entire villages to monasteries and cathedrals. This was done in exchange for pro anima grants, perpetual prayers for the donor's soul. In a world where hell was understood as a literal physical place of fire and torment, land was a pretty small price to pay for the promise of intercession. This created a unique and often really tense economic reality known as mortmain, or the dead hand. Because the church was a corporate body that never actually died, once land was gifted to a monastery, it never reverted back to the king through inheritance or forfeiture. The dead hand of the church gripped the land forever, which often frustrated kings who watched their tax bases shrinking as more and more land became ecclesiastical, and therefore exempt from many traditional feudal taxes. The church itself was organized along strictly feudal lines, mirroring the secular pyramid of power. High-ranking clergy such as bishops and abbots functioned exactly like secular lords. When a man was appointed as a bishop, he wasn't just receiving a spiritual office. He was receiving what was called a temporality, a vast collection of manors and resources. Because these lands were held as ecclesiastical fiefs, these princes of the church owed the same feudal duties as any secular baron. A bishop was required to provide a specific number of knights for the king's army. While the bishop himself was technically forbidden by canon law from shedding blood, he was still expected to show up at the muster. To bypass the literal interpretation of the law, many of these fighting bishops famously carried a mace, a heavy, blunt instrument, rather than a sword, arguing that they were crushing bones rather than shedding blood. In the Holy Roman Empire, this blending of the mitre and the crown reached its absolute peak with what were called the prince-bishops. These men were absolute sovereigns of their territories, like the archbishop-electors of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier. They were high-ranking vassals of the emperor, but they ruled their lands with their own courts, their own coins, and their own private armies. This blurring of the lines meant that a monk's vow of poverty was often completely at odds with the staggering wealth and political influence of his abbey. To the average peasant, the local abbot wasn't just a spiritual father. He was a landlord who collected the same rents and demanded the same labor services as any secular knight. To justify this entire hierarchy, the Church promoted the really influential social theory of the three orders. This was a tripartite view of society that explained why inequality was not only necessary but divinely ordained. This theory divided humanity into three functional groups: the orators, or those who pray, the bellators, or those who fight, and the labrators, or those who work. The clergy were seen as the head of the social body, providing for the spiritual health of the entire community. Because they interceded with God on behalf of everyone else, they were exempted from physical labor and secular taxes. The nobility were the arms, providing protection, while the peasantry were the feet that supported the entire structure through their toil. By framing society in this way, the Church made rebellion against the feudal order seem like a rebellion against God's natural harmony itself. One of the most complex and often boring, but absolutely vital aspects of the feudal church was its independent legal system. The Church operated under canon law, which was based on the Bible, the writings of the Church Fathers, and the decrees of various popes and councils. This created a dual jurisdiction across all of Europe. If a priest committed a crime, he could not be tried in a lord's manorial court or even in a king's royal court. He was entitled to something called benefit of clergy, meaning he would be tried in a church court instead. These courts were generally much more lenient, often substituting penance or defrocking for the execution or mutilation that was common in secular law. This led to some famous and bloody political explosions, most notably the conflict between King Henry II of England and Thomas Becket. Henry wanted criminous clerks to be punished by the same laws as everyone else, while Becket defended the Church's liberty from secular interference. The tension between these two legal worlds was a constant feature of the entire Middle Ages. The monasteries, such as those of the Benedictine, Cistercian, and Cluniac orders, were the administrative and economic hubs of this entire system. A great abbey like Cluny in France was a massive corporate entity, controlling hundreds of smaller priories scattered across the continent, all paying dues back to the mother house. Monks were actually viewed as spiritual warriors. In a world where people believed in a literal physical battle between angels and demons, the liturgy, performed by the monks, was seen as a vital defense system for the kingdom. A lord would grant a fief to a monastery so that the monks could perform the Opus Dei, or the work of God, around the clock. This intercessory prayer was essentially a form of feudal service. The monks fought the devil so that the knights could fight the Vikings. Economically, the Cistercians were particularly influential in shaping the European landscape. They often settled in remote, waste lands, the borders of the feudal world, and through their disciplined, communal labor, they turned swamps into farmland and established massive wool trading networks. By the 12th century, the Cistercians were the most successful agribusiness in all of Europe. They were the absolute masters of water power, using sophisticated mills and irrigation systems that far surpassed what was found on the typical secular manor. This proves that those who pray were often highly effective at those who work, using their literacy to keep meticulous records of crop yields, sheep counts, and market prices. The Church also attempted to regulate the inherent violence of the feudal nobility through two major movements: the Pax Dei, or Peace of God, and the Truga Dei, or Truce of God. The Peace of God was a decree that threatened excommunication for any knight who attacked unarmed people, such as the clergy, peasants, and merchants. The Truce of God attempted to limit the actual time allowed for fighting, prohibiting warfare on Sundays and then eventually expanding to include Thursday through Monday, as well as holy seasons like Lent and Advent. While these decrees were frequently ignored by hot-headed knights, they represented the first international effort to establish what we might call rules of war. They shifted the definition of the knight from being basically a lawless thug to being a defender of the faith, a transition that eventually paved the way for the Crusades. While the bishops lived in actual palaces, the daily life of the peasantry was guided by the humble parish priest. In many cases, the advowson, the legal right to appoint the local priest, belonged to the lord of the manor. This meant the priest was often a loyal servant of the Lord, reinforcing the feudal message from the pulpit every single Sunday. The priest oversaw the collection of the tithe, which was the 10% tax on all agricultural produce. This was a heavy burden on the poor, but it funded the only social safety net that existed. The church was the only institution that cared for the sick, the elderly, and the orphaned. It was the physical and spiritual center of the village, marking every milestone of a person's life, from baptism to marriage to the final preparation for death. The rhythmic tolling of the cathedral or abbey bells across the fields was the soundtrack of the feudal world. It reminded every single person that while their bodies belonged to their Lord, their souls belonged to God, and the church was the sole gatekeeper of that soul. This spiritual leverage made the church an indispensable and often truly terrifying partner in the feudal order. Without the church to sanctify the oaths of fealty and provide the moral framework for the hierarchy, the entire feudal mountain would have likely crumbled into chaos much sooner than it eventually did. As we continue forward, we'll see how this intricate system, built on land, loyalty, and the threat of eternal damnation, began to face pressures that would eventually lead to its transformation and, in many places, its collapse. Section 6. The Rise of Towns, the Merchant Class, and the Shifting Economy. For centuries, the feudal system appeared as this unshakable mountain, a landscape of static social ranks and rural stability where every man knew his place and every acre of land was tied to a lord. However, by the late 11th century and throughout the 12th century, the first significant cracks began to form in this monolithic structure. These cracks didn't emerge from a single revolutionary event or some massive battlefield defeat. They came from a slow, steady, and irreversible revival of trade and the growth of urban centers. This process, often called the Urban Renaissance, introduced a completely new way of living that the rigid feudal contract was never designed to accommodate. To understand the beginning of the end for feudalism, we need to examine the burghers, the legal liberation of the towns, and the transformation of a barter society into a monetary one. The traditional feudal worldview allowed for only three types of people: those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. By the year 1100, a fourth category began to emerge that fit none of these definitions: the merchant and the craftsman. These individuals lived in burghs, fortified settlements often located at the intersections of trade routes, river crossings, or near the walls of an existing cathedral or castle. These inhabitants became known as burghers in Germany, bourgeois in France, and burgesses in England. Unlike the peasant, the burgher didn't produce wealth through manual labor on a lord's domain. Instead, they produced wealth through the exchange of goods and the mastery of specialized skills. This created a really profound legal problem because under feudal law, every person was supposed to have a lord. But how could a man who spent his life moving goods from London to Bruges to Cologne be bound to the soil? The very nature of commerce required a level of personal freedom and legal mobility that was completely opposed to the personal bond of the feudal system. Initially, towns grew on land that belonged to a feudal lord, either a secular baron or a high-ranking bishop. These lords naturally attempted to treat the townspeople like high-value serfs, demanding labor services, tolls on every bridge, and the right to judge all disputes in their own manorial courts. The townspeople, however, possessed something the lords increasingly lacked, which was ready cash. Starting in the late 11th century, towns across Europe began to engage in what historians call the communal movement. They pooled their wealth to basically buy their freedom, negotiating with their lords for charters of liberty. A charter was a precious legal document, often written in Latin on vellum and sealed with heavy wax, which formally exempted the town from feudal obligations. These charters typically granted several specific liberties that were truly revolutionary for the time. One of the most important was burgage tenure. This was a completely new form of landholding where, instead of paying for their house through labor or military service, the burgher paid a fixed annual money rent. This allowed them to sell, lease, or mortgage their property, actions that were strictly forbidden for a feudal vassal. The charters also explicitly stated that townspeople didn't have to plow the lord's fields or harvest his grain. Furthermore, towns were allowed to elect their own officials, such as a mayor or a provost, and create a town council to handle their internal affairs. Perhaps most importantly, towns were granted the right to hold their own courts. Feudal law, which was based on land and military honor, was completely useless for settling disputes over a shipment of spoiled wine or a defaulted loan. The law merchant emerged as a faster, more flexible system of justice based on commercial fairness rather than the sword. A famous legal custom emerged during this era. Stadtluft macht free, or town air makes you free. In many regions, if a runaway serf managed to live within the walls of a chartered town for a year and a day without being caught by his lord, he was legally declared a free man. This created a powerful drain on the feudal manors, as the most ambitious and desperate peasants fled the fields for the promise of the city. You have to imagine the allure of the medieval city to a peasant who had never seen a building larger than a barn. These were places of noise, color, and opportunity, even if they were also cramped and plagued by absolutely terrible sanitation. The city represented a crack in the great chain of being where a person might actually change their destiny through their own wits and hard work. The growth of towns was fueled by, and in turn fueled, the return of a money economy. Since the fall of Rome, Europe had been largely a natural economy, where people bartered chickens for shoes or labor for land. By the 12th century, the opening of silver mines in regions like the Harz Mountains in Germany and the increased trade with the Byzantine and Islamic worlds brought coins back into circulation. This shift to currency changed the very psychology of the feudal lord. A lord who once wanted 10 days of labor from a serf now wanted 10 silver pennies so he could buy a silk robe from the East or a better suit of armor from an Italian merchant. This led to a process called commutation. Lords began to commute, or trade the old labor services for cash rents. On the surface, this seemed convenient for everyone, but it subtly destroyed the feudal bond. When a vassal pays his lord in coins rather than in life and limb, the relationship ceases to be a sacred, personal oath of loyalty and becomes just a simple commercial lease. The soul of feudalism began to evaporate, replaced by the ledger of the early modern world. While the towns were breaking away from rural feudalism, they created their own internal hierarchies known as guilds. These were professional associations of merchants and craftsmen that dominated the urban landscape. There were two primary types: the merchant guild, which controlled the overall trade of the town, and the craft guilds, which represented specific trades like blacksmiths, weavers, bakers, and goldsmiths. The guilds acted as a monopoly of the middle. To work in a town, you absolutely had to be a member of the guild. Like the feudal system, the guilds were strictly hierarchical. A young boy started as an apprentice, living in a master's house for 7 years to learn the secrets of the trade. He then became a journeyman, a skilled worker who traveled from town to town for daily wages. Finally, if he could produce a masterpiece that met the guild's high standards, he became a master, with the right to open his own shop and vote in the guild assembly. Though the guilds provided stability, they were also intensely conservative. They regulated absolutely everything from the price of bread to the width of a piece of cloth. No one was allowed to work after the church bells rang for vespers, because the lack of light might lead to poor quality, which would shame the entire guild. The guild system was in many ways an urban version of the feudal manor, providing security and order at the expense of competition and innovation. They were the primary social safety net of the city, taking care of the widows of deceased masters and providing for the education of their children. The guild hall was the center of social life, a place for feasts and theater, showing that the urban dwellers were creating their own community rituals to replace the homage of the countryside. The impact of towns varied significantly across Europe. In northern Italy, the towns became so powerful that they completely swallowed the feudal system. Cities like Venice, Florence, and Genoa became independent city-states. The local counts and barons were actually forced to move into the cities and live as urban nobles, often engaging in trade themselves. This urban nobility created a culture that was vastly more sophisticated and wealthier than the rural nobility of the north. In Germany, the free imperial cities like Lübeck and Hamburg formed the Hanseatic League, which was a powerful commercial and defensive confederation that had its own navy and could dictate terms to kings. These cities owed their loyalty directly to the emperor, bypassing the local dukes and counts entirely, which created a massive political hole in the feudal map of the Holy Roman Empire. In England and France, towns remained more integrated into the national structure. The kings of these nations often acted as the protectors of the towns, granting them charters in exchange for taxes. This created what historians call a royal urban alliance. The king used the townspeople's money to hire professional soldiers, which meant he no longer had to rely on his fickle feudal vassals for his army. This was the beginning of the centralized state and the end of the knight's monopoly on warfare. The town hall and the marketplace had arrived to challenge the castle. While the knight still rode and the serf still plowed, the economic engine of Europe had moved. The feudal mountain wasn't falling yet, but the soil at its base was turning into liquid currency. If we look at the physical geography of these towns, we can see how they were built for commerce rather than defense alone. Unlike the manor, where land was plentiful, city land was incredibly expensive. This led to that iconic medieval architecture of narrow houses that grew taller and wider as they went up, with the upper stories often hanging out over the street to maximize floor space. The streets were organized by trade. You would have the street of the butchers, the street of the tanners, and the street of the goldsmiths. This created a sensory overload for anyone visiting from the quiet rural manor. The smell of the tanning pits, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer, and the constant shouting of merchants created this vibration of life that felt entirely new. This urban life also led to the birth of the university. As merchants needed to keep records and towns needed to manage their legal charters, the demand for literacy and law absolutely skyrocketed. Institutions like the University of Bologna and the University of Paris emerged, originally as guilds of students and teachers. These centers of learning began to rediscover the works of Aristotle and the codes of Roman law, providing the intellectual tools that would eventually be used to dismantle the feudal legal system. When a lawyer in a city-state argued that law should be based on reason and written statute rather than ancient custom and private oaths, he was firing a shot at the very heart of the feudal world. As the 13th century came to a close, the boring facts of land and labor were being overwritten by the facts of gold and commerce. The castle was no longer the only center of power. The town hall and the marketplace had arrived to claim their share. The rigid three orders of society had been broken by the arrival of the middle class, a group of people who didn't fit into the prayers, the fighting, or the farming. This new class was ambitious, literate, and above all wealthy. They were the harbingers of a new age, and as we move into our final section, we'll see how a series of global catastrophes in the 14th century would take these cracks in the feudal mountain and turn them into a total collapse. Final thoughts: the long shadow of the feudal world. As we look back across the centuries, It's really tempting to see feudalism as this primitive or dark detour in human history, a chaotic era of muddy fields and ironclad warriors. But as we've explored tonight, the feudal system was, in truth, a masterpiece of survival. It was a rational, if absolutely grueling, response to a world that had lost its center. When the great Roman systems of law and commerce vanished, feudalism provided the joined hands and sworn oaths that allowed civilization to catch its breath and keep going. The legacy of this boring system of land tenure and personal loyalty is still woven into the fabric of our modern world. When we speak of a landlord, when we expect a judgment by a jury of our peers, or when we discuss the social contract between the governed and the government, we're using the language and the logic of the medieval manner. The knights have long since traded their chainmail for the pages of history books, and the great open fields have been fenced into private property. But the concept that power carries responsibility, and that loyalty is a mutual bargain, that remains with us. The sun has finally set on the age of the castle and the fief. The rigid three orders of those who pray, fight, and work have dissolved into the complex, fluid societies we inhabit today. Yet, beneath the pavement of our modern cities and the digital networks of our global economy, the foundations of the medieval world remain. We are the heirs to those boring legalities, those sacred promises, and the quiet, rhythmic labor of the millions who came before us. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through the landscape of the Middle Ages. If you found peace in the history of the manor or interest in the rituals of the hall, I hope this exploration has provided both clarity and rest. The world of the knight and the serf is now silent, but its story continues in the way we live, the laws we follow, and the history we share. Until next time, learn history or be doomed to repeat it.